Good afternoon and welcome all. On behalf of Father Carol Ellis, Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, we do welcome you to the 32nd Annual Patristics Medieval and Renaissance Conference. And like Kevin, I also too want to recognize the debt that we in the college have for the work that Tom Lasansi did in breaking the ground for this conference and maintaining it for the first 30 years of the program. I also want to acknowledge the work that my young colleague and former student Kevin Hughes has done in the last 3 years, to bring this conference to its current state, and will continue to make it a good conference that will complement what happens in Kalamazoo. It is my honor today to introduce our plenary speaker. David Bakewell Burrell, Congregation of Sacred Cross, is the Theodore M. Hesburgh Professor in Philosophy and Theology at the University of Notre Dame. David took his advanced degrees at the Gregorian University, where he was fortunate to work with Bernard Lonergan, and later at Yale University, thereupon returning to teach at his undergraduate alma mater, where he had been a Wilson Fellow at the time of his graduation. He has been a member of the faculty at Notre Dame since then, serving as chair of the theology department there for 9 years. David's philosophical and theological interests are reflected in his scholarly works. Among others, he is the author of Aquinas and Philosophical Language, Exercises in Religious Understanding, Aquinas, God in Action, Knowing the Unknowable God, and Freedom in Creation in Three Traditions. He's also responsible for several translations. Indeed, his turn to comparative understanding in matters religious has marked his career for the past 3 decades. His work in Jewish, Christian, Muslim relations has been at the heart of his intellectual inquiries. He has lived and worked around the globe, holding places and positions in such places as Bangladesh, Jerusalem, and Cairo. Currently, he comes to us from his residence at the Bishop Macaulay House in Uganda, where he is now teaching. His work has been characterized, I would say, and developed through his personal and passionate commitment to coming to know the other, a commitment to the belief that we are always being challenged to enlarge our own implicit horizons regarding what we deem to be the human ideal. Now, while others may be inclined to speak of the other in a highly abstract and idealized manner, David, on the contrary, has chosen to immerse himself into those worlds and to come to know them as they know themselves. But a special reason for being honored to give this introduction to David is I do want to pass on a couple of personal acknowledgements. My first day in graduate school, Monday morning at 9:30 in the administration building under the Golden Dome, I was looking to audit this upper division philosophy of science class. The master schedule said that Ernie McMullen was going to be teaching it. Little did I know that he'd become chair and wouldn't be teaching it. And this young, energetic CSC father comes waltzing into the classroom at Monday on 9:30, ready to start teaching this undergraduate philosophy of science class. And so I began my career at Notre Dame, and the first time in the class with Dave Burrell as my teacher. And from the very beginning, when we read Russ Hanson's Patterns of Discovery, what Dave did was to teach me how to think as a philosopher. All my other classes my first year were history classes, where I learned how to think like Plato or learned how to think like Hegel. In Dave's class, we weren't allowed to do that. We had to actually think. We actually had to philosophize. My second year, I was lucky enough to be given the honor to be Dave's teaching assistant in his undergraduate logic class. So first he mentors me how to be a philosopher. The second year he teaches me how to teach. My third year at Notre Dame, I and my friends, we began to go to Morrissey Hall, where Dave was the rector. We'd leave the library at 5 o'clock, say goodbye to Touchdown Jesus, and walk to the other side of campus, where Morrissey Hall was, down by the rock, where David was the rector. And we would look forward to the 5:05. I think it was a 5:05 Mass day that you would celebrate, where we would hear the word, we would experience the liturgy, and we would also get a 3-credit course in philosophical theology every afternoon. My fourth story is in my next year at Villanova, when we were at a conference much like this. And as a matter of fact, an hour ago, Dave wrote something and passed me the note, not knowing that I was going to tell the story. He passes me a note. We're at a conference that Dave is sponsoring on philosophy of religion. It was on the NEH 6-week seminar. His good friends David Tracy and Vic Preller were there, and his one-time journey mate Michael Novak, the young Michael Novak, was there. Michael's hair at that time was black and still down to here, and he was still reminiscing about the Grand Park demonstrations in 1968. He had not yet taken the turn. And David passes me a note, and he says, "Jack, what you should be writing your dissertation on is," and he went on, "description and explanation." I wrote my dissertation on the exact topic that David passed me that note on. Now, having mentored me as a teacher, as a student, as a minister, and as a dissertation advisor, although he was not strictly speaking my dissertation advisor, my very last day on campus, before I came to Villanova, my very last day on campus, Father Burrell presided at my marriage in the chapel in Notre Dame campus. The man was my mentor in all so many ways, and it is my absolute pleasure to introduce to you Father Dave Burrell on faith, reason, and culture in Christianity and Islam. Welcome, Dave. And we would also...
Thank you so much, Jack. You know, we don't realize all the things that we do because we just do them. And I think that's important for every teacher to know. And sometimes in precious occasions like this, you realize what you did. Thank you. In the wake of John Paul II's exploratory encyclical Fides et Ratio, Faith and Reason, published in 1998, one of my confreres, then serving as rector of a Catholic seminary in Africa, was invited to Rome for a global consultation on the complex relations between faith and reason. It's the first time in his life he had ever been a rector magnificus. This is Tom McDermott, and if you knew Tom, he was least susceptible of being a rector magnificus. His African perspective emboldened him to add culture to the diptych, to form the triad reason, culture, and faith. When he told me, I was initially impressed by his unwitting insertion of Charles Sanders Peirce into the discussion. Any polarity is ever in danger of becoming just that, so a third will invariably be needed. That's why marriage counselors have a role. Beyond that general recommendation, however, I wish to explore his recommendation as a way of expanding the faith-reason discussion in a way which will invariably entail, as we shall see, a keen ear for analogous language. Indeed, it's surprising that a person so cognizant of culture as Karol Wojtyła, alias John Paul II, should apparently elide it in his telling treatment of faith and reason, especially after having noted in the chapter detailing the interaction between theology and philosophy, how, in his words, reason itself, in accord with which Christians experience their faith, is soaked in the culture of the place nearest to it, and in its turn ensures that with the progress of time, its own nature is bit by bit transformed. Reason itself, own nature, bit by bit transformed. Should have heard a note of that in Regensburg. My work on Aquinas has shown how, despite his frequentation of Paris as a venue for teaching and scholarship, his Mediterranean roots positioned him to encounter an Islamic philosophy of Hellenistic inspiration, as Louis Gardet calls it, to determine how to put at the service of Christian thought in general, as well as to facilitate his specific task of showing how theologia should be a scientia. And I'm not just being precious there, because you can't translate theologia, as all medievalists know here, into theology, nor can you translate scientia into science. So, but Aquinas' task was to determine, his specific task, I believe, how theologia could possibly be a scientia, a way of knowing. I have proposed how an encounter with cultural difference fertilized his prescient metaphysical elaboration of faith in a free creator shared by Jews, Christians, and Muslims, something which all of these communities averred, but which each had articulated in different ways. Moreover, it may have been the dominant role which creation must play in Islam, which motivated Islamic thinkers to develop this article of faith far more than either Jews or Christians. Christians, of course, developed redemption. Jews developed covenant. For while it can be said that the coming down of the Quran to humankind via the prophet parallels the covenant of God with Israel and the incarnation of the Word in Jesus, what the Quran asserts in countless ways is the origin of all things in the one God, to the point where their central religious thinker, Al-Ghazali, will insist that the meaning of faith in divine unity, Tawheed, which is the heart of Muslim faith, is that there is no agent but God Most High. That is, in the absence of either covenant or incarnation, the creating activity of the one God is central for Islam, though to be sure, it is the verses, ayat in the plural, of the Quran which alert human beings to recognize things in this world as signs, ayat in the plural, of the presence of the Creator. So the Arabic word for sign is the same as the Arabic word for verse, and it's only in meditating on the verses of the Quran that we begin to see things as signs. That's kind of understood in Islam. But how can we recognize things as signs? Remember, it took Augustine, well after his acceptance of the truth of the Christian faith, to be able to interrogate the earth, all things that are in the earth, the sea and the depths and the creeping things, the winds that blow, the heavens, the sun, the moon, the stars. They all cried out with a great voice, He made us. In their very being, they had become for him signs that they were created by one God, and freely so. Yet it's the common testimony of those who live among Muslims that their cultural formation offers them a palpable sense of God's presence in their lives. Something similar can be said of observant Jews' sense of the reality of God. Famously, Jews will contend passionately with God, yet resist denying Him, even while renouncing His claims on them. In each case, these pervasive attitudes can be traced to the way religious practices shape the contours of their lives. The Shabbat for Jews, the ritual prayer Salat 5 times a day in Islam. My suspicion is that recurrent practices of this sort provide each cultural group with a paradigm for their understanding of the cosmos. Nor need the practices be religious. Recurrent practices of other sorts, like shopping, can shape mentalities as well, giving a characteristic face to human ideals like freedom. Indeed, when President Reagan took Premier Khrushchev on a visit to a discount store in Iowa, touting it as freedom, Khrushchev could only query, is that freedom? So it seems that our access to any lofty ideal will be by way of the practices which enact it in our culture. This unsurprising statement can be corroborated by what happens to us when we experience other ways of shopping or of eating a meal. Often the variance between our practice and those of different cultures will make us aware that there can be better ways of doing what we set out to do. So we learn that there are variant ways of eating, or shopping, or praying. Teaching and learning, seen as correlatives, can differ dramatically, say, between state schools in Egypt and those conducted there by members of a religious community. Indeed, the difference is so telling that Muslim families, ambitious for their children, prefer the Catholic schools. Children learn better. All this is quite understandable once we are reminded that education is an analogous term. The attitude of teachers to students in a school conducted by a religious community reflects the religious formation of the teachers themselves in their care for the children, while teaching in a state school may easily be bereft of any hint of that. Government teachers may do their job by prevailing standards, but parents can see that the results fall far short of those elicited by the other milieu. Now, if practices, ordinary or sublime, shape our understanding of key notions like freedom or education, then the same must be true for honorifics like rationality. Again, reason and faith, right? Yet mentioning this can elicit the specter of relativism for some philosophers. So let us return to a seminal article by Peter Winch, 1964, variously reprinted, entitled On Understanding a Primitive Society. You have to follow me because this is a bit sinuous, but for some people old enough may have been formed on this article like I was. In it, Peter Winch takes issue with a yet earlier pronouncement of Alistair MacIntyre. This pronouncement had presumed the invariance of reason Peter Winch wants to show how reason will always be exercised differently in diverse milieux, themselves shaped by differing sets of characteristic practices. Now, since this very strategy has itself come to be the hallmark of MacIntyre's later work, recalling this debate of the 60s can help remind us how our intellectual culture has shifted over the past half-century. The question is simple, which Peter Winch and MacIntyre addressed. How can the Azandi, or any people, continue to pray for the success of their crops once they buy into modern methods of agriculture? Which begins by taking issue with the way in which the distinguished British anthropologist Evans Pritchard, known in the trade as EP, had described Azandi supplicatory practices in his Witchcraft, Oracles, and Magic Among the Azande, printed in 1937, contrasting their efficacy with fertilizers and other modern methods. Winch proposes to make contact with Western readers by noting how, in Judeo-Christian cultures, the conception of "if it be thy will," as developed in the story of Job, is clearly central to the matter in which I am discussing. Acknowledging the vast difference between the Azande magic Christian prayers of supplication, he offers that, nevertheless, they are alike in what they do, in that they do or may express an attitude towards contingencies. Whether a man sees point in what he is doing will then depend on whether he is able to see any unity in his multifarious interests, activities, and relations with others. What sort of sense he sees in his life will depend on the nature of this unity. He then criticizes his interlocutor, that is the 1962 MacIntyre, for missing this dimension of the matter in his treatment of Azande magic. He can only see in it a misguided technique for producing consumer goods. But Azande's crops are not just potential objects of consumption. The life he lives, his relations with his fellows, his chances for acting decently or doing evil, may all spring from his relation to his crops. Indeed, Winch goes on, our blindness to the point of primitive modes of life, is a corollary of the pointlessness of much of our own. Capitalism even turns agriculture into another mode of production. I introduced this scandalously truncated version of their exchange to remind us what Alistair MacIntyre himself, of course, has gone on to detail. How cultural shifts can affect alterations in our very criteria of rationality. And that our efforts to grasp others' practices in matters which challenge our presumed categories can indeed reveal lacunae in those very presumptions. Before illustrating this dramatic reversal, we shall have to excoriate the specter of relativism. That's a favorite papal specter, but we will need first the reminder with which Winch leaves us, that the very conception of human life involves certain fundamental notions, which I shall call limiting notions, which have an obvious ethical dimension, and which indeed in a sense determine the ethical space within which the possibilities of good and evil in human life can be exercised. Winch appropriates T.S. Eliot's trinity of birth, copulation, and death to suggest that the very notion of human life is limited by these conceptions. Moreover, the indication that these are indeed limiting notions demands that we be able to speak of them analogously as we find them articulated differently in diverse cultures. Just a short interlude on the so-called specter of relativism. It's crucial to note how Enlightenment presuppositions about reason and truth raise relativism to the stature of a threat. For they presume a normative set of rational criteria available to all, over against which any claim to other sets of criteria is utterly unsettling. This is what makes a bugbear of relativism, that there are no longer any operative norms across human discourse, so power and even violence will have to arbitrate. Yet, like earlier debates over natural law, there may be other ways of thinking about those criteria which are not so laden with specific beliefs, but which have to do with the fact that persons formed in quite diverse traditions do, in effect, talk with one another. Indeed, once the idol, I-D-O-L, of pure reason has been shattered, and we can learn to accept diverse ways of arriving at conclusions, we will also find that we can employ the skills learned in our tradition to follow the reasoning in another. Traditions, in other words, may indeed be relative to one another in ways that can prove mutually fruitful rather than isolating. Traditions which prove to be so will be those which avail themselves of human reason in their development, so the patterns of stress and strain in their evolution will display their capacity for exploiting the resources of reason. In short, relativism, focus on the ism, gives way to the human fact that all inquiry takes place within a tradition, and the specter which it evoked turns out to be the residual shadow of our faith in pure reason, that is, in the pretension of human inquiry, bereft of any tradition. Incidentally, and this is very important in speaking of tradition, an authentic tradition can be distinguished from an ideology by its capacity for self-criticism. So in other words, ideologies resist self-criticism, an authentic tradition invites it. Though this attempt at normative definition also reminds us how often so-called religious traditions can also topple over into ideologies, resisting criticism. So the discovery on the part of reason that every inquiry employs presuppositions which cannot themselves be rationally justified, that's Gadamer, of course, opens the way to self-knowledge on the part of Enlightenment philosophy itself, which must then take its place among the traditions. That's McIntyre's point. And once that has been accomplished, the specter of relativism gives way to the task of developing the skills needed to negotiate among traditions, which can be negotiated because they can be found to be related to one another. And since we have become accustomed to associating faith with tradition, and rightly so, we must then renounce the operative Enlightenment view representing faith as an addendum to the human condition. For if that view itself reflects a tradition whose account can be rendered in historical terms as a reaction to the devastating religious wars in Europe, then the Enlightenment will itself display a recognizable convictional basis, and faith will once more emerge as part of a shared human legacy, though no longer, thank God, distorted by its authoritarian shadow. Then the intellectual task on the part of reason operative in any tradition which survives the test of time becomes one of learning how such traditions develop. Most often, in fact, by learning from and assimilating other traditions. In this way, reason becomes a functional notion, displayed in practices which cut across traditional boundaries, rather than expressing a set of substantive beliefs which must be adhered to in those very terms before discourse can be undertaken. Rationality will then show itself in practices which can be followed and understood by persons operating in similar fashion, yet from different grounding convictions. These different traditions all share the need to talk about what they believe, hence the analogy with debates about natural law. What is sufficiently shared so as to be dubbed natural need not be substantive norms regarding human actions, but rather the overriding demand that any normative law must express itself in coherent discourse. That very activity which displays the fruitfulness of human ingenuity also contains operative terms by which astute participant observers can recognize analogies across traditions of inquiry, as Socrates, assembling linguistic reminders for Thrasymachus, made him abandon his projected discourse without Socrates having to exert any force at all. For these reminders have to do with the possibility of any discourse at all, and so governed the tradition Thrasymachus was defending, as well as the totally opposed one which Socrates had set out to elaborate. Yet Book 1 of the Republic hardly confirms Socrates' own arguments. It simply displays the terms for any debate. In other words, it takes up the Humpty Dumpty question. We can't make words mean what we want them to mean. One may, of course, go on to embed those terms in a richer framework, as Plato does in the subsequent books of the Republic. But the exchange with Thrasymachus in Book 1 stands on its own as displaying the coherence of the linguistic practice which makes the rest of the work possible. We will need to elaborate that coherence into a philosophy, for practice alone seldom offers a persuasive display of its own cogency. Yet these reflections should remind us that elaborations are secondary, and may even be manifold, though they will be able to be elucidated relative to one another. So reason in our pluralistic age assumes the shape of dialogue, a path to progressive mutual understanding, which the young political theorist at Wellesley, Roxanne Euban, dubs a dialogic model of interpretation. Yet dialogue can only take place among persons. Systems cannot converse with one another. And even dialogue between persons can generate into a dialogue of the deaf if each one comes representing a position. So the prerequisite for dialogue among persons seems to be a shared interest in pursuing the truth of the matter, no matter how firm are one's convictions on the subject. Yet if those very convictions presume that the path one is traveling is the only way to arrive at truth in such matters, then the goal has already been circumscribed and dialogue is rendered nugatory. So we see that truth must transcend any given conceptuality, and that each participant must be committed to questing after it. Yet, as we have already remarked, what once seemed an obvious path is no longer available to us. That philosophy, or untrammeled rational inquiry, represents a neutral achievement accessible to those willing to renounce their particular paths. That, of course, is the Enlightenment dogma. In this sense, we cannot consistently espouse an account of religious pluralism, which retains the modern presumption that we philosophers can survey diverse religious traditions from a superior vantage point. That's John Hick. The alternative to presuming such objective neutrality is to turn to an intersubjective encounter with persons prepared in the way in which we have described, namely, willing to search together for the truth to which they are singly committed, but which they may name quite differently. Such a commitment turns out to be uncannily close to that classical view of friendship first articulated by Aristotle. Indeed, once we realize that only friends of this sort are able to continue their conversation despite disagreement, then friendship will prove more telling to our search for truth than agreement. It also is a way of putting to rest the bugbear of relativism. An intercultural example of faith and reason interacting. Let me illustrate this point by showing how attending to debates endemic to another tradition can illuminate our own. And that's probably the whole point of what I'm trying to show. Yet, like the points of contention between Winch and McIntyre, we shall have to unscramble a complex genealogy to do so. For we must first deconstruct the Orientalist misreading of the fate of philosophical inquiry in the Islamic world, to discover ways in which that sinuous unfolding, properly understood, can help us discover fruitful interaction between faith and reason in our own tradition. We are familiar, I think many here would be familiar, with the standard story of Arabic and Islamic philosophy, for it represents a modern Western construction, like Africa, right? It begins with the spectacular overtaking of the hinterlands of the Byzantine Empire in the 7th century by disciplined and motivated bands from the Arabian Peninsula who before long sought to assimilate the high culture of that empire. Utilizing the offices of Syriac translators, they made key Hellenic philosophical texts available in Arabic, facilitating the emergence of signal thinkers like Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, Avicenna, and Averroes, Ibn Rushd, Averroes Ibn Sina Avicenna. And as the equivalent Latin names illustrate, these philosophers, called falasifa in Islam, they didn't have a word for it, so they coined it, inspired cognate Christian medieval thinkers, with Ibn Rushd naming an entire way of thinking Latin Averroism. The import of this East-West cultural exchange in the 11th through the 13th century proved especially significant for the West, while the movement in the Islamic world was soon to lose its vitality. In the standard story, the culprit was another Islamic thinker, Al-Ghazali, whose trenchant attack on the philosophers is said to have sharply curtailed their influence in Islamic culture, indeed to have spelt the demise of reason in Islam. It's that standard story that Benedict XVI was unfortunate enough to adopt at Regensburg. Right? In the fresh story, I shall propose, Al-Ghazali will also function axially, but less as a culprit than as announcing a second philosophical phase to be carried out in the heartland of Islamic civilization, as the center returned from Cordova to Baghdad, turning on such luminaries as Suhrawardi, Ibn al-Arabi, and Mullah Sadra. Al-Ghazali's dramatic role is presaged in the work of Moses ben Maimon, or Maimonides, a Jew so thoroughly embedded in the Islamicate that he may well be classified an Islamic philosopher. Not a Muslim philosopher, but an Islamic philosopher. A sustained inquiry, including Ibn Sina, Al-Ghazali, and Maimonides, as well as Thomas Aquinas, had sought ways to formulate a coherent account of creation which highlighted the Creator's freedom, since Jews, Muslims, and Christians each had a stake in the outcome. Indeed, including Maimonides and Aquinas helps us to see how Islamic philosophical theology resonated beyond the borders of Islam itself. For the issue of the Creator's freedom underscores the unique relation of Creator to creatures in each Abrahamic tradition, though it proved inherently difficult to articulate philosophically. Indeed, the celebrated emanation scheme introduced into Islamic philosophy by Al-Farabi and elaborated by Ibn Sina could serve to elide the peculiarity of this relation by naming the one, adopted from Plotinus, as the first. For despite Al-Farabi's eloquent delineation of the uniqueness of this first, his strategic employment of the scheme of logical deduction to model the relation of the one to the ensuing many effectively introduces that one as the originating axiomatic principle, which differs from subsequent premises only in its functional place in the system. This goes back to Jack and my logic course, right? Moreover, the fact that such an axiomatic model also introduces logical necessity runs counter to the role which the Creator's freedom plays, for only a free Creator can enjoy the privileges of that oneness which Muslim tradition enshrines in Tawheed, Jewish thought in God's unity over against idolatry, and which the 4-century-long Christian path to triunity displays as well. What's hidden in that little phrase is a reminder that it took 4 centuries for Christianity to get straight about its central doctrine of faith. Why? Because of the Shema. Shema O Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. God, our God, is one, right? And so any attempt to think of triuneness in any other way, as some theologians invariably will try, misses the point that it took 4 centuries for Christianity to get straight about its central doctrinal affirmation. I think that's astounding. In short, if the origination of the universe is a matter of necessity, its source cannot qualify as a creator in the sense demanded by each of the Abrahamic faiths. One of the central complaints Al-Ghazali lodged against the philosophers in Islam. Yet the rhetorical form of these respective revelations, that is the Bible and the Quran, proved unable to clearly articulate such distinctions, allowing the Creator to be pictured anthropomorphically in the fashion of the demiurge of Plato's Timaeus, as the second creation account does. Nevertheless, a free Creator would have to be distinct from creatures to be the Creator, so the uniqueness of the relation will emerge forcibly. So Ghazali was correct to underscore the inability of those whom we identify with the initial phase of Islamic theology to develop the metaphysical strategies needed to relate creatures to their transcendent origin. Yet his critique did have the effect of ushering in a second phase of thinkers, all beholden to Avicenna's axial distinction between essence and existing, to articulate the sui generis character of the relation between a free creator and the universe. The fact that the presence and the valence of this second phase of thinkers is hardly recognized in the West suggests how the standard story of philosophy's demise in the Islamicate reinforces a picture of reason encapsulated in the Enlightenment. For the reason these later thinkers espouse will be intimately intertwined with faith in a free creator. These figures emerge to mark our phase. Three figures emerge to mark our phase two. Sukhravardi, who lived in the 12th century, Ibn al-Arabi, who in the 13th, and Sadruddin al-Shirazi, or Mullah Sadra, who lived in the 16th. While Ibn al-Arabi actually journeyed from Andalusia to the Levant to carry out his extensive and intensive inquiries in Damascus, each of these thinkers embodies that shift from west to east, or in ways which will need to be nuanced, from a peripatetic and largely Aristotelian philosophical milieu to one more sympathetically Platonist. Moreover, given the fact that their exposition will contend with the ineffable relation of creator to creature, one will find recurrent recourse to poetic and allegorical tropes in their writing, though it would be misleading to present their mode of inquiry as attempting to transcend philosophical discourse. Indeed, one may note how Ibn Sina's later allegorical writing presaged this development. So someone in the first phase already was conscious of the way the second phase development would have to be, and not just someone, but the key axial figure really in the first phase, Ibn Sina. For there's little doubt that classical Islamic philosophy in both phases espouses philosophical inquiry as a way of bringing inquirers themselves closer to reality, in this case the creator of all. Following Pierre Hadot, we can regard these thinkers as underscoring the existential telos considered endemic to philosophical inquiry itself among the ancients, a view which has come to prove quite amenable to a postmodern sensibility. And it is precisely this feature which makes Al-Ghazali so axial a figure in our story, with a valence quite opposite to that in the Standard account. In our story, he moves philosophy on to a higher thing. In the Standard account, he does it in period. Both Muslim and Christian traditions turn here to practices, which can serve to move our understanding beyond formulations, especially when the structure of the formulae themselves displays their insufficiency. Pierre Hadot shows us how ancient philosophy invariably incorporated practices as part of its method. A longtime translator of Plotinus, it appears that the very effort of translating, itself a spiritual exercise, alerted him to the difference between a modern and a classical conception of the virtues required to do philosophy. Indeed, modern philosophy seldom alludes to intellectual virtues, contenting itself rather with propositional attitudes. Yet when one presses the attitude dimension, something like virtue, in fact, emerges. That is to say, modernity's account of what philosophy is and how one engages in it may well prove inadequate to the activity itself, which could also explain why philosophy continues to criticize itself and not merely its findings. The focus of philosophers like Stephen Toulmin and Alistair MacIntyre on practices can help us see how Hadot's presentation of ancient philosophy is far more pertinent than an historical exercise, as his recent summary statement in What is Philosophy, his book, What is Philosophy, articulates. Mullah Sadra will explicitly contend that we will need some special illumination to attain the appropriate metaphysical standpoint. Lacking something of that sort, as Rudy Tevelde intimates, Aquinas' crucial formula, that the very being of God is to be, cannot but appear ungrammatical. It is, of course, but deliberately so, like poetry. Yet those who are attuned to what it displays rather than what it cannot say, will be able to make connections with Plotinus pointing to a one beyond being, to find both Aquinas and Mulassadra engaged in a similar struggle to attain the requisite metaphysical standpoint, that is, one beyond the common conception of being, or Heideggerians like to call ontotheology. And it was his own engagement with Plotinus' intellectual journey which taught Hadot the need for spiritual exercises to follow his mentor. Indeed, the master-disciple relationship and all that it portends offers a useful way of characterizing the exercises relevant to attaining this metaphysical standpoint. And as I have been suggesting throughout, Hadot's recommendations may offer Western philosophers a way to appreciate the strategies of these Eastern philosophical theologians with the demands such strategies make on those who would practice them. Now, there can be no demonstration of these matters since existing defies definition, yet we are ineluctably led to realize that we cannot understand created things properly without a sustained attempt to grasp the internal link they have with the Creator in their very existence. While this mode of inquiry exceeds the bounds of philosophical inquiry as normally practiced by Islamic philosophers in our first stage, like Ibn Sina, it's arguable that they too realized that an authentically philosophical search must move into these more existential and esoteric arenas. Yet Mulassadra's inspiration is clearly Ibn al-Arabi, as anyone acquainted with William Chittick's lucid presentation of that illustrious sheikh will immediately detect. By using existing as the fulcrum, one can detect continuity in intent from Al-Farabi to Mulassadra, with comparative links to Aquinas. The goal is wisdom, shared by what we have marked as two phases in Islamic philosophy, though the second phase reveals a marked shift to incorporate that goal more explicitly with the practices which allow one to approach it. For that approach is redolent of the Sufi desire to come near to the one from whom all that is continually derives. So the ineffable relation between the one and all that derives from it becomes an existential journey for the inquirer, since our very inability to articulate the relation invites us rather to traverse it personally, inshallah, God willing. Now this clearly breaches the bounds of what we in the West normally identify as philosophy. From the strict boundary between philosophy and theology, which Neo-Thomist ideology established in Catholic colleges and universities, to the unilateral hegemony which analytic philosophers of religion claim over matters theological, which exempts them, of course, from tracking sophisticated intellectual developments in the unfolding of Christian thought. Yet the late and indomitable Richard Rorty gave indirect testimony to the bankruptcy of this thoroughly modernist view of philosophy when he personally abandoned it to announce its demise. But what if the second phase of Islamic philosophical inquiry offers us a fresh start in its efforts to elicit a robust faith in a free creator by expanding the bounds of the earlier phase, which Enlightenment philosophers, as I said with some recent support by Pope Benedict, had jejunely identified with reason itself. In other words, the first phase of Islamic philosophy is reason. Allow me a simple and concluding illustration. Some years ago, my colleague Alvin Planiga elaborated, with appropriate logical finesse, a way of defending human freedom in the face of a theistic affirmation of an all-knowing and all-powerful God, a ploy soon dubbed the free will defense. He showed how, on a strong libertarian view of freedom, as he would put it, we can assert human beings to be free, both from determinism by cosmic forces and from divine influence, going on to insist that such libertarian freedom must be an essential ingredient of any Christian philosophy. Always uncomfortable with this ploy, it took a suggestion by Brian Davis in New Blackfriars to help me see why, allowing an obvious comparison with developments of Islamic philosophical theology to show how to deconstruct this ploy. Brian Davis noted, again quite simply, how the penchant to remove human freedom from the purview of the free creator simply misconstrues a creator's agency, as if it bore any relation to causal determination. Early Islamic religious thought had clearly demonstrated a similar move, motivated by the same concerns, when it initially removed free human action from the ambit of the Creator's activity, as though humans acting freely had to be creators in their own right. The latent premise here, implicitly at work in Plantinga and others enamored of his ploy, is that human action must be a creatio ex nihilo if it is truly to be free. These Islamic religious thinkers soon realized, however, that such an intellectual strategy would effectively remove an inordinate portion of creation itself from the Creator's sway, all of human action. Right? So they came to adopt another path, whose sinuous ways would require too much time to elaborate, but which I did in the Freedom and Creation in Three Traditions. But the fact remains that the school which had promoted human freedom by exempting it from the Creator's ambit, so-called Mutazilite school in Islamic history, has regularly been touted in the West as just that, defenders of human freedom. What is instructive is that analytic philosophers of religion have fallen into the same trap, and that I would suggest for two reasons. First, that an untrammeled libertarian account of human freedom suits our cultural climate, which is, of course, the supermarket. And more acutely, because they have signally failed as a group to develop the metaphysical strategies elaborated by the second phase of Islamic philosophers, of elucidating the sui generis relation between creator and creature. And I can only attempt to explain this obvious lacuna by identifying the modernist penchant to do it all from a philosophy, in relative ignorance of theological developments attending free creation in one's own tradition as well as in other Abrahamic faiths. Perhaps this final polemical stab will suggest why I have developed this foray into faith and reason as substantially affected by culture and cultural difference, and done so in a deliberately comparative way. Is there indeed any other way to carry out an inquiry in philosophical theology in our time? Thank you. Oh, yes. Tom.
Thank you very much for your talk.
Thank you.
One might at first think that you suggest that we moderns step away from the philosophical tradition, especially the tradition of philosophical theology as it's developed most recently in analytic philosophy, and start
It's best called philosophy of religion. It isn't theology at all, really. Although I may try to adopt the name.
But the story you told about Islam, phase 2 develops out of phase 1.
Mm-hmm.
And also in your own life, you have engaged with modern philosophy and the philosophy of religion.
Sure.
And
Good point.
what's more, some young people in graduate school can't help but be trained by these.
They got to master that stuff.
That's right. So do you have any words of sort of practical wisdom about how to move into phase 2 without being too, while still engaging in the way you described in the first part of your talk with those trapped in phase 1?
Tom Feeney has a very good point to make, I think, and it shows up what happens when you do a polemical presentation like I did at the end, because you're always leaving out one side. It's often important, by the way, when you do a review of a book, to figure out what the guy's polemic is. What's he against? What's he angry about? You know? I think you're right, Tom. In presenting, however, an overview, and particularly doing it interculturally, what I would like to explain to the current graduate students who are mastering these logical ploys is to raise the question of whether or not this mode of analysis is adequate to the subject that they're dealing with. And I think you're absolutely correct to say that when they raise that, all I want to do is get them to raise the question. But they're going to raise it and develop it and do it in a quite different way than I'm able to do. And that's the way in which things might even progress, despite my anti-Gailey stance. That's a very good point. A very good point. Dennis?
Yeah, just very quickly, I mean, there are people you can read, aren't there? I mean, you can read Peter Keach, you can read Elizabeth Anscombe, you can read Alistair MacIntyre. These are all people brought up within the analytical tradition, employing the tools of that interface between classics and the philosophy of language and so on, which so characterizes that Oxford and then Anglo-American School of Analytical Philosophy. So there, I mean, there are plenty of examples of how you can actually do it.
Very good.
So, I mean, to reduce analytical philosophy to the caricature that it's only about logic or something,
Sure.
it is, well, just simply to fail to read some of its best products. So.
Very good. Excellent. And Barry Miller, who's a student of Peter Keach, has done some excellent things on existence and naming gods. Yeah.
And a perfect example of what you yourself were saying about the way in which traditions of reason, our traditions actually affect our kind of reason, would be to take an example of a modern Thomist recently died, Herbert McCabe, who reads Thomas. He never ever tells you the text that he gets it from, by the way, but anyway, he reads Thomas in the light broadly of Wittgenstein, or something like Wittgenstein version of Wittgenstein. So it seems to me there are models available.
Sure, very good. Yes.
In Remy Bragg's latest book, The Law of God, and his discussion of the history of Islamic philosophy, it seems to me he's making, at least in sort of overall form, an argument very similar to the one you want to make, at least as Ghazali relates to the earlier philosophers. That is, he considers Ghazali to be really the summit of Islamic philosophical thought about the law. But I think his reasoning for that is something like the difficulty faced by the earlier wave of Islamic philosophy is that they were pressing too far in the direction of a kind of eminent God, a cosmological God, and that's too much at odds with the kind of utter transcendence of God in the Islamic understanding.
Or perhaps with the practices of the Sharia, if he's talking about law. You know, Remy gave me that book, and I haven't read it yet. I wish I would have read it because I could carry this forward with you. I'm not sure that he himself is acquainted with the people, acquainted with them. I'm not sure he himself has studied it and worked through what the people whom I'm identifying with phase 2. I'm just not sure.
He doesn't deal with them in the book, but he does emphasize that the achievement of Ghazali is precisely the elevation of the practices of the law as a means of achieving a kind of union with God.
Very good. Yes, that's the point of the Holy Chiago in his Summa Theologiae. Yeah, excellent. Yes?
You viewing Ibn Rushd's response to Al-Ghazali as ineffective, as a failure. His book can be Incoherence of Incoherence, critiquing Ghazali, which Ibn Rushd actually came after Ghazali. And are you viewing that as he did not turning the tide that somehow Ghazali has caused?
No, I'm not viewing it that way. I'm stating in a standard view, and this is generally accepted, that any reasoned response to a Fox News polemicist won't work.
Okay.
And it
That
must
sounds
be,
like Al-Ghazali.
right.
It
Must be said that Ghazali's Incoherence of the Philosophers is a very polemical work, and Michael Marmora, who's a wonderful student of Avicenna and of Ghazali, constantly reminds us that we should never take the polemical statements in the incoherence of the philosophers to be what Ghazali really thinks. He's in a sparring context, you see, is what he is. So we have to go to the Ihya al-Madin, which is his constructive Summa Theologiae, which is laced with philosophical arguments, as Remy Bragg suggests, to find a real Ghazali. So that's, and you know, I want to underscore this because, of course, given the availability of texts and things like that, in a philosophy class, it's so easy to take the incoherence of the philosophers and the incoherence of the incoherences, displaying, you know, the whole sides of the debate, and it won't get you very far. That's the sad thing. Right? I'm right now translating a work from French to English this time of my colleague at Hebrew University, Avital Bowman, who prefers to compose in French, on Ghazali's Tafrika, which is his work that was translated as by Sherman Jackson as Tolerance in Islam. And that's a much more illustrative, real encounter between the two than the incoherence of the philosophers versus the incoherence of the incoherence. So that's just a kind of that's a footnote for you. Can't make words mean. So in other words, what I'm saying, in our world, where the contrast is with an absence of faith, the differences in faith are less important than the fact that people have faith. I think rhetorically. Yeah, Dennis?
Just a quick one. I'm not sure Thomas would have found Islam incomprehensible. I mean, I don't remember any comments of his on this. He does actually say that it's just false, but not incomprehensible, and there should be more than one incarnation. He just thinks it's false. Now, that's quite a big difference on how you relate with it. If you write it's incomprehensible, then you've got one set of attitudes which comes into play. If you think it's just wrong, but comprehensible, then you've got to argue, you've got to get engaged, you've got to think it through.
I was actually going to what I thought was the underlying attitude. Aquinas, as you know, says very little about Islam as such, about a religion. He really had no relationship with it. And the standard line was to say it was a Christian heresy, and that was a way of comprehending it.
Yeah.
But what I think was jarring to people was that they had to precisely reach for this way of explaining it because on the face of it, it was incomprehensible. I didn't say Aquinas says that. The face of it, it just blows your categories apart. So you invent this Christian heresy thing. Yeah.
I really enjoyed your distinction between tradition on the one hand and ideology on the other. And even your example of Christians taking 4 centuries to figure out how to talk about the unity of God. Thinking about exactly that example, though, I'm wondering how to differentiate, or if we can even talk about this in the abstract, ideology from definition. Because it would seem, exactly given that example, taking 4 centuries, the road to Chalcedon, as it were, for lots of Christians, that's an ideological ploy, and not the basis of a grammar.
We've known each other for some time, but I didn't know you'd set me up for my favorite story. Those of us who've done what I've worked our way through these transmutations in Christian thought know the best book on this, to my mind, is I'm going to lose his name, that's my age. Anyway, I'll think of it in a moment. It's called Does God Change? By Thomas Weinandy. And it reads like a detective story. All the various logical possibilities that people went through of how to relate this Jesus to God. Right? And it's a wonderful little book. And so, aided and abetted by Tom Weinandy and others, I began to see the real genius in this Chalcedonian formula. Right? I'm in Amman, Jordan, and I'm coming back from celebrating 150 years of us in Bangladesh, and I go to a parish in Amman with my Jesuit friends to celebrate Mass for the Filipina community, and he introduces me to the pastor. And the pastor tells me, this is Jordan now, that he comes from a particular village in Jordan. And I say to him, gee, how come there's so many Latin Christians, that's us, Latin Christians in that part of the world, that come from that village? Oh, he said, my grandfather was pissed off at the Orthodox priest. I said, well, that's the way it usually works. But then in the very next sentence, without skipping a beat, he transgressed 12 centuries, the 13. He said, and when those guys came up in the Arabian Peninsula, we didn't know anything about Islam. We just knew they weren't Greeks. So much for Chalcedon. Why did many churches not accept the Chalcedonian formula? Because the emperor imposed it. I mean, and it's like Lee's point about rhetoric. Here you get power comes in, you see, and yeah, I thought that was wonderful. We just knew they were Greeks. Yeah. Yes.
Actually, could I follow up? Because this distinction, I think, was something that struck me as well.
It's Alistair McIntyre's, really.
Yeah, but my question is, how do we relate the fact that tradition, I mean, even in its linguistic formulation, is related to something that's received as opposed to something that's formed? And does that work into that distinction as well?
Let me put it this way. Again, it may be Alistair's distinction, but I learned it from my mentor, Bernard Lonergan, in Rome. And we were indeed discussing the road to Chalcedon. And of course, at that time, I was studying theology in the late 50s, mind you, shows how old I am. At that time, there were all sorts of people who wanted to take these formulae and revise them, you see. So Lonergan's answer to this question, which was also, by the way, one of the shortest and pithiest definitions of hermeneutics I've ever heard in my life. He said, in his Eastern Canadian twang, he said, well, if these are answers, then you better find out what the questions are to which they were the answers. That's hermeneutics. Right? So if you try to find out what the questions were to which these were the answers, then you can learn something from the whole process, you see. And you're not being fed, spoon-fed, the end of the, mix a million metaphors here, the end of the sausage machine. So I think that's and you see, this is, but Lonergan's thing is very key to people within a tradition, and if only people within a tradition functioned that way, then people who look at the tradition from the outside wouldn't be so tempted to see it as always fixed and having to simply receive, or if you will, walk lockstep with certain formulae. Whereas if it's our task to understand what the questions were to which those are the answers, and his presumption here, of course, isn't one way or another, we're all going to have those questions, right? Then that's how we can learn from the history. And by the way, there's a very telling example of that right now, largely in Israel, but also in other countries, of so-called Jewish believers in Jesus. And I find it to be a very poignant discussion, because if I were a Jew, and I came to appreciate that Jesus brought the original covenant to an unprecedented focus, I'm not sure what I would do, what step I would take. Because given the passage of history, and I won't say it's impossible, but it's very difficult for a Jew simply to become a Christian, you see. I think it's important for us to feel that. So these are people who are trying to indeed acknowledge, as Jews, that Jesus gives an unprecedented focus to the Hebrew Scriptures. What's their Jesus like? Well, they don't quite know. In other words, they're going to have to go through the whole first 5 councils of the church, at least as Lonergan sees it. I think he's right. These are questions there, are in that quest trying to grapple with the Shema, God our God is one, and the fact that we pray to Jesus. So these things are very live issues in certain domains, and that's why I think it's fascinating. The history can be fascinating because we see it as not just a way in which the community came to this, but a way for us to appropriate it as well, in such a way as we don't simply come forward and say, well, Muslims believe Jesus is the Son of God, and Christians believe Jesus is the Son of God, and Muslims say God can't have a son. So it must be in contradiction. And even a guy as astute as Paul Griffiths made that mistake in one of his writings. He doesn't anymore, but we talked about it. But the point is, these are understood in different contexts, and they're understood as meeting different goals.
Yeah, on that point, I guess I kind of wanted to probe you a little bit as to whether there is any insight being expressed in the claim that Islam is a Christian heresy. As to say,
Interesting. That's a good point. Never thought of that. Thanks.
Is a sort of simultaneously an expansion and intensification of the covenant, and then the Islam claims to not only to surpass Jesus, but to but also, I mean, it does about Jesus.
Well, yeah, that's a later polemical addition, of course. That's a very, very good point. But simply as a way for us to kind of get out of the bind, but it could be expressed. And if one inquired into that in an ironic spirit, I think you could really learn a lot. There's something about that, though, that's interesting in its own right. You see, if you think of the papal statement, it wasn't papal, wasn't it for the doctrine of the faith or something, Domine Jesus, wherever that came from, talking about the uniqueness of Christianity, etc. It raised a lot of hackles. In one way, there's a very simple answer to that question, particularly when you're dealing with the Abrahamic faiths. The uniqueness of Christianity is the fact that our revelation is not in a book but in a person. It's that simple. Now, there we have, I think, certain groups which verge on heresy. I'm speaking of my Texas evangelical friends, who really think that the revelation is in the New Testament and not in Jesus. So I call them Muslim Christians. I think the revelation is fundamentally in the book.
So is that a Muslim heresy?
Sure would be. So in other words, the heretical, as Paul says in one of his encyclicals, one of his letters, which I can only quote in Latin because it's so important to me in my learning of theology, oportet hereses esse. It's necessary that there be these divisions and these heresies. Yeah.
It speaks of something that I was thinking of too, and both the example of the ecumenical councils and the Islamic example shows that your distinction, which I think is right and helpful, between ideology and tradition, in a way can only be ideological, even though its participants can be very ideological,
Right.
and so these things
Right.
are very messily entangled in these exchanges, and so it's a sort of analytic a posteriori distinction, to sort of tease out what in this is ideological and then what is advancing those questions that Larian speaks to.
This is a very, very important point. And you see, in my experience, our community's been in East Bengal for 150 years, now Bangladesh. And it's a 92% Muslim country. And they recently had to enact a law against proselytizing. They were very careful in formulation of the law, and it came down to offering monetary exchange to convert to Christianity. Now, unfortunately, this had been the practice of Baptist missions, because although you may or may not know it, Baptist missions are funded on a soul count from the home base. Okay. Now, the fact that our priest brothers and sisters had for a considerable length of time, not the whole 150 years, but a considerable length of time, had secondary schools in which 93% of the students were Muslim, and of course, given the kind of education that I alluded to, that we're able to give as a religious community, these young people, they ended up being, high functionaries in the government. they knew from that set of practices that part of what's going on here is that ways in which we can, operative way, in a practical way. And what do? And it's always been a point I've never quite understood this properly, because Catholics tend not to worry about, broadly speaking, a Protestant need. And why is that the case? Well, I don't know. I don't know how to explain the difference, but I do know what we do in Bangladesh. We are educating students from the elite. I mean, we slums too, from what we came from the elite. That's all right. Another story. But what we try to do is help them to see that one of the responsibilities that they gain with the education they have is passing on the ability to read and write to others. So we organize the students, Muslim as well as Christian, and Muslim, 92% Muslim, to give literacy classes to the rickshaw lamas, to the lads who are driving rickshaws. And, you know, this becomes then the thing to do so that the youngsters get into it. But when you hear their parents talking, their parents are saying, you know, you are doing what we should be doing. Now, what are we doing? We're just following Matthew 25, that's all. You know? So we are giving witness, but we don't have to mention the name of Jesus, so to speak, because that calls attention to, you know, overt difference. I think there are ways of doing it. Yeah.
I just wanted to add, it's interesting that you brought up Bangladesh in this context. The previous question about Islam being Christianity, there is a movement, I don't know if you're aware of it or not, among Muslims in Bangladesh that is very parallel to the Jews for Jesus, sort of a Muslims for Jesus movement, in which they see no inconsistency between belief in Jesus and belief in Islam. Now, it's caused a number of controversies. Somebody recently revised the whole New Testament and replaced the words "the Son of God" with the Messiah. And so the question is, well then, what is the minimal belief that or act that we want to see that identifies one as Christian as opposed to Muslim? And it's a Protestant movement, so of course you don't have as
High Christologists.
the same, yeah, the same type of problems one might have trying to be a Catholic.
Let me say that the figure of Jesus is very equivocal, and because we mean quite different things by Jesus than they do by Jesus.
Yes.
And that's why what I try to say in comparative stuff, and I learned this actually from Wilford Cantwell Smith, is that if you try to compare, the obvious comparison is Jesus and Muhammad, the Bible and the Quran. You don't get 5 minutes with that one. And then you start raising all these nasty Western questions. When are they going to start doing historical critical method on the Quran? See, it's a different kind of book. It's a different kind of animal. The way I like to do it, and again, this I learned from Wilford Cantwell Smith, is that the parallelism in these formulae also exhibits the difference. And the formulae are the following. I'll tell you a funny story about it. It's really good. The parallel of the following. We believe that Jesus is the Word of God made human. Flesh, whatever you want to name. They believe the Quran is the Word of God made Arabic. So the parallelism is between Jesus and the Quran and Jesus. And Sufis who recite interiorly in what they call dhikr, which is a form of meditative prayer, the names of God are tantamount to Christians receiving the Eucharist. Now, I once was given a talk, this is the story. I was given a talk in Jackson, Mississippi, this years ago, and the talk was on Islam and Christianity, which was a college where they once prayed at 1 o'clock on Friday, but they don't anymore listen to people talk. See, so it had to be at 1 o'clock on Friday because that was the standard time set, of course, academic curriculum. Now, of course, 1 o'clock on Friday, the Muslim community was at prayer. So the guy who organized it realized this gaffe, so he called the organizers of the Muslim community to have tea with me in his house. So I was looking forward to this. In walked 3 African-American women who run the mosque in Jackson, Mississippi. Right? They were very bright, they were very articulate, and I started off just with that simple formula. I said, that's right. So we go on for a good time, you know, nice tea too, and
And one of them turns to me and said, Father, you know so much about Islam, why aren't you Muslim? And I love that question because it shows how much they love their faith. And I said, well, you know, I have a quick and dirty answer to that. And I usually don't give it out, but we've really gotten to know one another. Remember those formulae we started with, yes? So we believe that Jesus, the Word of God, made human, and you believe the Quran is the Word of God made Arabic, yes? Well, you can't hug a book. I thought that would end it. Without skipping a beat, one of them came back and said, Father, we prefer our God not gendered, thank you. Now, if you think of all the ink the Christian feminists have spilled on this issue, if the Word of God's going to be made human, you got a simple choice. Is it a boy or a girl? So it's very interesting. I thought that was, I just eat with people who really are deeply into it. Yes?
I want to piggyback a little bit off of Kevin Hughes' question, but also pick up on some strands of things that you talked about. I'm intrigued by this notion that rationality shows itself in practices, and I'm also intrigued by the claim, I think you were quoting someone, that reason in our pluralistic age assumes the shape of dialogue. I want to ask you to riff on those a little bit more. But in particular, the reason I'm intrigued by them is because it resonates with me as a medievalist when I think about what reasoning was, what philosophizing was for someone like Aquinas or Anselm, right? Where you're functioning within a community, whether it's a Dominican convent or a studium or a monastery, and it's less about the answers, I think, than it is about you know, the ascent through the Psalms for Anselm, or for Aquinas, the articulation of the question, the use of distinction, and more importantly, debate with the other members of the guild, right? You know, to pursue wisdom. So
these practices had a context.
That's right. That's right. There's a community. There are practices embodied there, and I think, incidentally, you know, one of the mistakes of some neo-Thomism, as you point out, is to identify with the answers, right, rather than with the practices in the community.
It's dialogistic. It's, you know, it's dialectic.
Exactly. So what I wanted to ask you to help me sort of think about this more, and one of the things in particular I'd ask you to help me think about, Father, is with a practice, right, there has to be a certain boundary. McIntyre uses the illustration of sports, right? And sports only work if there are rules, because if I'm playing frisbee golf and you're playing croquet, it's really not a sport anymore. It's not practice. I mean, you win because you have a hammer. I have three
Well, that's Alice in Wonderland too, you see. That's a croquet, right?
So I'm interested in these ideas that it's communal, that's practice, but I'm sort of wondering how you work in the boundaries.
Okay.
Or to use one of your metaphors, what's the grammar?
I understand. Well, we're all into Wittgenstein here, folks. We're just doing a little parsing of Wittgenstein. I tried to use the parallel illustration of natural law discussion, right? And you know Kobezi's book, the one that Stan Hauerwas and I like so much, called Moral Notions, where it reminds you that certain of our discourses, you don't just go out and have an abortion like you have a haircut. You know, you can discuss whether it's right or wrong, etc., but it isn't like a haircut, right?
I don't get either.
Go ahead. So I think that what the whole natural law debate comes down to is simply that this is my point about Book 1 of the Republic, that the limits are given by the coherence of a language. People say that the advantage of the guys who 11th, 12th, 13th century people was that they had this sort of Aristotelian framework to operate in, etc., etc., etc. But you know, fundamental grammatical work, and it calls attention. That's the thing that up on, and that I think forms the structure of his work, and I think he gets that from Plato, if we go back to Thrasymachus. So I think that, and that's what we normally call reason, the exercise of reason, is that we can speak coherently, right? Now, safer, but each of our religious traditions admits to a rupture in that, in the sense of the founding activity of each tradition, the giving of the Torah to Moses on Sinai, the incarnation of Jesus in the womb of Mary, and the coming down of the Quran, they're each something we have to swallow. But if we have a rich enough picture of God, and that's why the whole medieval thing about free creation was so crucial, then maybe we can swallow it. I tell my friends that to believe that the universe is freely created by one God is a huge thing to believe. But once you do it, at least have a chance of seeing your life as a vocation. Otherwise, you're stuck with a career. That's one way of looking at it, you know. So what I'm suggesting is that I think I would have to be persuaded that there are limits other than the limits of a coherent use of language that we need to see. Here's the point: we need to impose, and those limits aren't imposed, right? They're part of the structure of conversation between us. Right?
So just to see if I'm
With all Lee says about rhetoric has to be factored in here, of course.
So,
Yeah.
so is it your suggestion then that as we move forward with this conversation among the three traditions, or however many
Mhm.
traditions,
Sure.
that in a certain sense what we have to do is sort of figure out what the grammar for this new conversation is?
No, we have to carry out this conversation in a language that we find to be coherent. Now, there are going to be new givens, and do they fit? And we might find Muslims might think they fit better than we might think they fit. But of course, no out-and-out rationalist, and this was Ghazali's critique of Ibn Rushd in this regard, sort of Aristotle rei vivus, no out-and-out rationalist is going to agree to the founding principles of any one of our faiths. By the way, Salman Rushdie's satanic verse is very illustrative here. Remember what that raised in the West about, you know, the freedom of discourse and stuff. Anybody remember how that book begins? Everybody talks about it, nobody reads it. It wasn't a very good book, actually. He couldn't take on the faith issue. That book begins with a Lockerbie-like explosion, 33,000 feet, from which the two protagonists are thrown free of the aircraft and make a perfect three-point landing in the British Channel and swim ashore. Now everybody says, well, this is magic realism a la Gabriel Garcia Marquez. What Muslims see immediately is a mocking of the coming down of the Quran. If you can believe this, then you can believe the Quran came down from God. Because the same word nozzle for coming down is the same word you say to the bus driver in Cairo when you want to get down. Right? So built into his opening gambit was challenge. And those are the challenges I think that everybody of our faiths has to accept. I mean, you know, how is it one can believe in the incarnation of the Word of God in Jesus, and how the whole development of the Trinitarian theology was needed to bolster that, and it took us 4 centuries to get there, so it wasn't an easy thing to achieve. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm listening to this, and I like the discussion of grammar and establishing a new grammar, but there is a grammar on the table between Christianity and Islam. Especially in the Eastern Orthodox Church. In the Syriac Church, in the 8th and 9th centuries, they were constantly discussing many of these very issues. I was wondering, I mean, as much as the Greeks like to deny it happened, but it happened there too. You can't separate the iconoclastic controversy from the expansion of Islam and the discourse that's going on there. So
It wasn't Cromwell on the left.
I guess, and I'm an Eastern Orthodox Christian, so I'm listening to this, and I know, how do we plug in that as well? Because there is a grammar and a dialogue that we can...
Absolutely crucial. How we do it is, we get Eastern Orthodox historians and theologians to talk about it. And you know as well as I do that they're mum about it.
Yeah.
So, one of my complaints, of course, don't forget I come from Jerusalem, where the Eastern Orthodox, face of Eastern Orthodoxy is the worst it isn't anywhere in the world. But I just want this tradition to stand up and be counted. And what you say is exactly correct. Now, there are some people, I was just hearing the other day, but I forget where, I can't make the connection with some people in the Eastern Orthodox tradition who are trying to mine, indeed go back to the documents and that kind of stuff. And in a way, it ham-handed this guy Huri, whom the Benedict quoted, was trying to... There were disputations in the West, and there were also disputations in Asians. Yeah, very good.
I'll pass that on to our bishop.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, get them going. Have we gone long enough,
I
Kevin?
think we have gone long enough. Please join me in thanking